I'm going to tell you a story about the Korean War. This story begins long before fighting started, because the roots of the war lie in history, geography, and global politics. Korea is a peninsula in East Asia, located between China and Japan. For thousands of years, Korea had its own culture, language, and identity. In the early 20th century, Korea lost its independence and came under Japanese rule. From 1910 until 1945, Japan controlled Korea. During this period, many Koreans suffered. Their land, labor, and resources were taken, and their culture was suppressed. Life was difficult for ordinary people, especially farmers and workers. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan surrendered, and its control over Korea came to an end. However, Korea did not immediately become a unified and independent country. Instead, it was divided by powerful nations that had helped defeat Japan. The northern part of Korea was occupied by Soviet forces, while the southern part was occupied by American forces. The division was made along the 38th parallel, an imaginary line across the peninsula. At first, this division was meant to be temporary, but political differences soon made reunification difficult. In the north, a government was formed with support from the Soviet Union. It followed communist ideas and was led by Kim Il-sung. In the south, a government supported by the United States was established under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. This government followed anti-communist principles. Both leaders believed they were the rightful ruler of all Korea. Each side wanted to reunite the country under its own system. Tension grew as both governments built armies and prepared for conflict. The world at this time was entering the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer allies. They represented different political systems and competed for influence across the globe. Korea became one of the places where this rivalry took shape. The division of Korea reflected the larger struggle between communism and anti-communism. Ordinary Korean people were caught in the middle of these global forces. Families were separated by the border, often unable to see each other again. By the late 1940s, clashes along the border became more frequent. Small battles and raids occurred as each side tested the strength of the other. Both governments believed reunification could be achieved through force. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. This marked the beginning of the Korean War. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. North Korean troops moved quickly, capturing towns and cities as they advanced south. South Korean forces were unprepared for the scale of the invasion. Many soldiers lacked equipment and training. As North Korean forces pushed forward, civilians fled in large numbers. Roads became crowded with families carrying their belongings, unsure where to go. Cities were bombed and damaged. Fear spread across the country as people tried to escape the fighting. The invasion drew immediate attention from the international community. The United Nations condemned the attack and called for member nations to assist South Korea. The United States took a leading role in organizing military support. Troops from several countries joined under the United Nations command. This made the Korean War an international conflict rather than a purely local one. For many soldiers arriving in Korea, the land and climate were unfamiliar. Mountains, rivers, and harsh weather made movement difficult. In the early months of the war, North Korean forces continued to advance. They pushed South Korean and United Nations troops into a small area in the southeast known as the Pusan Perimeter. This area became a last line of defense. Soldiers fought desperately to hold their ground. Supplies were rushed in by sea and air. Civilians in the area lived under constant threat, hearing the sounds of artillery and aircraft day and night. Life for soldiers during this time was exhausting and dangerous. Many were young and far from home. They faced intense combat, long marches, and little rest. The terrain made fighting difficult, with steep hills and narrow valleys. Weather conditions added to the hardship. Summers were hot and humid, while winters were bitterly cold. Frostbite and illness affected many troops. For civilians, survival became the main concern. Villages were destroyed or abandoned. Food was scarce, and shelter was often temporary. Families searched for missing relatives and tried to stay together as they moved from place to place. Children grew up quickly, witnessing violence and loss. The war disrupted every aspect of daily life. As the fighting intensified, the United Nations forces prepared a bold counteroffensive. This plan aimed to break the North Korean advance and change the course of the war. At the same time, leaders on both sides believed the conflict could still be won. The early phase of the Korean War was marked by rapid movement, confusion, and immense suffering. The future of the peninsula remained uncertain as forces gathered strength for the next stage of the conflict. The war was no longer just about Korea. It had become a key battleground in the Cold War, drawing in powerful nations and shaping global politics. For the people living on the peninsula, the war was deeply personal. It meant loss of home, family, and security. As the first phase came to a close, the conflict was far from over, and even greater battles lay ahead. As the summer of 1950 continued, the situation in South Korea became more desperate. North Korean forces controlled most of the peninsula and continued to press forward. United Nations troops and South Korean soldiers held their positions around the Pusan perimeter with great difficulty. Every day brought new attacks. Artillery fire echoed through hills and valleys. Soldiers dug defensive positions and tried to hold ground inch by inch. Supplies arrived by sea, but losses were heavy. Many believed that if this final line collapsed, South Korea would fall completely. At this critical moment, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of United Nations forces, proposed a bold and risky plan. He believed that instead of continuing to defend the small perimeter, a surprise landing far behind enemy lines could change the course of the war. The plan was to land troops at the port city of Incheon, near the capital city of Seoul. This area had strong tides, narrow channels, and heavy defenses, making the plan dangerous. Many military leaders doubted it would succeed. Despite these concerns, the decision was made to go forward. In September 1950, United Nations forces carried out the landing at Incheon. The operation caught North Korean forces by surprise. Soldiers moved quickly through the city and began pushing inland. At the same time, forces at the Pusan perimeter launched a breakout, moving northward. North Korean troops were suddenly trapped between two advancing armies. The situation changed rapidly. Many North Korean units were destroyed or forced to retreat. The successful landing marked a major turning point in the war. Soon after, United Nations forces moved to recapture Seoul. Fighting in the city was intense. Streets and buildings became battlegrounds. Civilians who had remained in the city faced fear and destruction as control shifted once again. By the end of September, Seoul was back under South Korean and United Nations control. The early invasion had been reversed, and the future of the war seemed to favor the United Nations side. With North Korean forces retreating, leaders faced an important decision. Instead of stopping at the 38th parallel, United Nations forces continued moving north. The goal was to reunite Korea under the South Korean government. As troops advanced, they encountered damaged towns and villages. Civilians were weary and uncertain about what would come next. Many had already experienced occupation by both sides. As United Nations forces approached the northern border near China, concerns began to rise. China had warned that it would not accept foreign troops close to its borders. Despite these warnings, the advance continued. In October 1950, Chinese forces secretly crossed into North Korea. At first, their presence was not fully understood. Then, suddenly, large numbers of Chinese soldiers launched attacks against United Nations forces. The entry of China dramatically changed the war. Chinese troops moved mostly at night, using surprise and speed. United Nations forces were unprepared for the scale of the attacks. Battles took place in harsh winter conditions. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers struggled with frostbite, lack of proper clothing, and exhaustion. Weapons sometimes froze, making them difficult to use. The cold added another layer of suffering to an already brutal war. One of the most difficult battles occurred near the Chosin Reservoir in late 1950. United Nations troops, including many from the United States and allied nations, found themselves surrounded by Chinese forces. Despite being outnumbered, they fought their way out under extreme conditions. Many soldiers were wounded or killed. Others suffered permanent injuries from the cold. The retreat was long and painful, but discipline and cooperation allowed many to survive. As Chinese forces pushed south, Seoul once again became a battleground. In early 1951, the city changed hands again. Civilians fled in large numbers, carrying what little they could. Roads were filled with refugees moving south in search of safety. Families were separated, and many never reunited. The constant movement of the front lines brought repeated destruction to the same towns and villages. By the middle of 1951, the fighting settled into a pattern similar to what had been seen in World War I. Front lines stabilized near the original division along the 38th parallel. Both sides dug defensive positions along hills and ridges. Artillery and small-scale attacks continued, but large advances became rare. The war entered a long and exhausting phase. Life for soldiers during this period was marked by routine and danger. Days were spent guarding positions, repairing defenses, and enduring harsh weather. Nights were tense, as surprise attacks were common. Soldiers learned to adapt to the terrain and conditions. Bonds formed between those who shared the same hardships. Letters from home became an important source of comfort. Civilians continued to suffer as well. Many lived in damaged homes or temporary shelters. Food shortages were common. Farming became difficult in areas affected by fighting. Children grew up surrounded by uncertainty. Schools operated when possible, often in makeshift buildings. Despite everything, people tried to maintain a sense of normal life. By the end of this phase, it became clear that the war would not be decided quickly. Neither side was able to achieve complete victory. The Korean peninsula remained divided, and the cost of continued fighting weighed heavily on everyone involved. Discussions about ending the war began to emerge, but fighting continued even as talks were considered. The Korean War had now grown into a prolonged and painful conflict. What began as a sudden invasion had turned into a struggle involving major world powers. For soldiers and civilians alike, the war became a test of endurance. As this stage ended, the conflict moved toward a long period of stalemate and negotiation, with peace still uncertain. As the war moved into its third year, the fighting along the Korean peninsula settled into a long and difficult stalemate. The front line stretched across hills and valleys near the 38th parallel. Both sides built defensive positions along high ground. Soldiers dug trenches, bunkers, and foxholes into rocky soil. Sandbags and wooden supports became part of daily life. These positions were constantly repaired as they were damaged by shelling and weather. Artillery played a major role during this period. Guns fired day and night, sometimes without visible targets, simply to weaken enemy positions or prevent movement. The sound of distant explosions became normal for those living near the front. Air power was also used extensively. Aircraft flew over the peninsula, dropping bombs and conducting patrols. While these operations aimed at military targets, nearby villages were often affected. Life for soldiers during the stalemate was mentally exhausting. Long periods of waiting were broken by sudden violence. Patrols were sent out at night to gather information or test enemy defenses. These missions were dangerous and quiet. A single mistake could lead to injury or death. Soldiers learned to move carefully and remain alert even when nothing seemed to be happening. The weather continued to shape the experience of the war. Summers were hot and humid, bringing heavy rains that turned trenches into mud. Winters were bitterly cold, with snow and strong winds. Frostbite remained a serious problem. Soldiers wrapped themselves in layers and used makeshift heating methods when possible. Simple comforts like warm food or dry socks became precious. While the fighting continued, efforts to end the war began. In July 1951, armistice talks started. These discussions took place in the village of Panmunjom. Negotiators from both sides met to discuss a ceasefire. The talks were slow and difficult. Disagreements arose over the location of the border, the return of prisoners, and the conditions of peace. One of the most sensitive issues was the treatment of prisoners of war. Thousands of soldiers from both sides had been captured. Conditions in prison camps varied, but life was often harsh. Food was limited, and medical care was basic. Some prisoners were forced to work. Others faced pressure to change their political beliefs. The question of whether prisoners should be returned to their home countries or allowed to choose where to go became a major obstacle in negotiations. Despite the talks, fighting did not stop. Battles continued along key hills and ridges. Some of these locations became famous for the intensity of combat. Control of high ground was important because it provided better observation and defense. Soldiers fought fiercely for positions that sometimes changed hands multiple times. The cost in lives was high, even though the front line moved very little. Civilians continued to endure the effects of the war. Many towns remained divided by the front line. People lived with constant uncertainty. Air raids and artillery fire could occur at any time. Families tried to rebuild homes damaged by earlier fighting, even as the war dragged on. Markets reopened when possible, and people returned to farming where land was still usable. In the South, South Korea worked to strengthen its government and economy with support from the United States and other allies. In the North, the government focused on rebuilding under Chinese and Soviet influence. Both sides used propaganda to maintain support for the war. Radio broadcasts, posters, and newspapers shaped public opinion and morale. For soldiers from foreign countries, the war felt distant from home. Many struggled with loneliness and fatigue. Letters and memories became important sources of comfort. Some found ways to create routines that helped them cope. Others counted the days until they might be able to leave the front lines. The emotional toll of the war was deep and lasting. As months passed, the armistice talks slowly moved forward. Small agreements were reached, but progress was uneven. Each side tried to gain advantage through military pressure while negotiating. The war became a balance between fighting and talking, with neither side willing to give up easily. By the beginning of 1953, exhaustion was widespread. Soldiers were tired. Civilians longed for peace. Resources were stretched, and the human cost continued to rise. The Korean War had become a long struggle without clear victory. The hope for an end grew stronger, but the path to peace remained uncertain. The peninsula stood divided, marked by scars of years of conflict. As negotiations continued and fighting slowly eased in some areas, the war approached its final phase. The decisions made in this period would shape Korea and the world for decades to come. As 1953 moved forward, the Korean War reached its final and most reflective stage. Fighting continued along the front lines, even while peace talks advanced. Soldiers remained cautious. Patrols still moved through hills and valleys. Artillery fire was less frequent than before, but it had not completely stopped. Many soldiers found this period mentally difficult because hope for peace existed, yet danger remained every day. The death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March 1953 changed the direction of the war. The Soviet Union had supported North Korea with weapons and political backing. After Stalin died, the new leadership focused more on stability and less on continuing a costly conflict. This shift helped push negotiations toward an agreement. China had also suffered heavy losses. Many Chinese soldiers had died or been wounded in difficult conditions far from home. Supplies were stretched, and public support was under strain. North Korea itself had been devastated. Cities were heavily damaged. Industry and agriculture had been severely disrupted. At Panmunjom, negotiations continued with renewed effort. Delegates met regularly, discussing maps, troop positions, and prisoner exchanges. One of the most emotional issues remained prisoners of war. Thousands of soldiers had been captured during the conflict. Some did not want to return to their original countries due to fear of punishment or political reasons. After long debate, an agreement was reached allowing prisoners to choose where they would go. This decision helped remove one of the largest obstacles to peace. Meanwhile, Soldiers on the front lines lived through long days of waiting. They repaired bunkers, cleaned weapons, and shared quiet conversations. Many thought about home. Letters were reread many times. Some soldiers had been fighting since the beginning of the war and were exhausted both physically and emotionally. The landscape around them showed years of damage. Trees were stripped bare, hills were scarred by shell holes. Villages nearby stood partly empty or rebuilt with simple materials. On July 27, 1953, the armistice was finally signed. When the news reached the front lines, reactions were calm rather than loud. Many soldiers felt relief mixed with disbelief. The sound of guns slowly faded. For the first time in years, long periods of silence settled over the peninsula. The armistice created a demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. This zone followed the current front line, close to the original 38th parallel. Troops were ordered to pull back. Observation posts were established. Rules were set to prevent direct contact. The war officially stopped, but it never truly ended. No peace treaty was signed. Technically, North and South Korea remained at war. This reality shaped everything that followed. The demilitarized zone became one of the most guarded borders in the world. Mines were laid. Fences were built. Soldiers stood watch day and night. Occasional incidents reminded everyone how fragile the ceasefire was. For civilians, the end of fighting marked the beginning of a long rebuilding process. In South Korea, cities like Seoul had changed hands multiple times and suffered heavy damage. Homes were rebuilt slowly. Roads and bridges were repaired. Schools reopened when possible. Many people lived in poverty, relying on aid and support. Families searched for missing relatives, often without success. The emotional weight of separation became permanent for many. South Korea began rebuilding its economy with help from the United States and other allies. Over time, industry expanded, education improved, and living standards slowly rose. The memory of the war shaped national identity and military readiness. Veterans carried their experiences into civilian life, often in silence. In North Korea, Reconstruction followed a different path. The government emphasized control, military strength, and loyalty to the state. The war became a central part of official history. The leadership promoted the idea of constant readiness for conflict. Resources were directed toward rebuilding infrastructure and strengthening defenses. Ordinary people faced strict control and limited access to outside information. The Korean War had a major impact on global politics. It confirmed the division of the world into opposing camps during the Cold War. The United States expanded its military alliances in Asia. China emerged as a major power willing to intervene beyond its borders. The conflict influenced later wars and military strategies. It showed how quickly regional conflicts could grow into international crises. The human cost of the war was enormous. Millions of civilians were displaced. Entire generations grew up shaped by loss and uncertainty. Soldiers from many countries returned home with injuries or memories that stayed with them for life. Families divided by the border remained separated for decades, often unable to communicate or reunite. Even many years later, the Korean War continues to shape the present. Talks about peace and reunification have happened at different times, but progress has been limited. The armistice still holds, maintaining an uneasy balance. The demilitarized zone remains a symbol of division and unresolved history. The story of the Korean War is not only about armies and politics. It is about ordinary lives interrupted by forces beyond control. Farmers leaving their fields, children growing up during bombing and displacement, soldiers enduring cold nights far from home. The war shows the cost of division and the long shadow conflict can cast over a nation. As time passes, memories fade for some, but the lessons remain. The Korean Peninsula stands as a reminder of how history shapes the present. The war ended the fighting, but its effects continue quietly. The hope for lasting peace remains, carried forward by those who remember the past and wish for a calmer future.